I think that we are actually now in a post-NATO environment.
Everyone's heard of it. Everyone knows the very, very basic definition. What exactly does it cover, Article 5? Can you explain it in a bit more depth?
Well, Article 5 of the Atlantic Charter is probably the most cited and least read um, paragraph in the whole of national security discussions. People assume that it's a kind of burglar alarm. You smash the glass and the police come running and protect you. And it really doesn't say that. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read it out because it's really worth just listening to the exact words, and I will stress what I think are the most important ones. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. That's the first paragraph of Article 5. Now, the key words in that are such action as it deems necessary. There's no requirement to do anything. It's a permissive clause that gives you the right under international law to respond to an attack on another NATO member. But if you choose to issue a cross press release, well, that's the action that you've deemed necessary, and you can do that and nobody can criticize you for it.
Wow. A huge element of ambiguity, perhaps, that people just don't realise, and presumably why people like you have been writing pieces suggesting Article 5 is under threat given the messaging coming out from Donald Trump well, really over the last 10 years or so.
I think that we are actually now in a post-NATO environment. The key letter in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is the A for Atlantic. I think what we've now really got is the European Treaty Organization, or maybe the Canadians sort of hanging in there. But the message that from the Trump White House is absolutely clear that they do not see it as the main, the duty of the United States to be the main guarantor of European security. Maybe they will act as a backstop in some circumstances, but the message from Secretary of Defense Hegseth and from Trump himself is, guys, you're rich, fix your own shit. And that's what we need to do. So we're now in an era where we may want to use Article 5 to defend each other here in Europe, and for European community members, European Union members. There's also a clause in the EU constitution which gives called the solidarity clause. But the idea that the Americans are going to come to the rescue is basically over.
I had written in preparation for this interview, the question, what are the circumstances under which the US would not step in? And I guess the way you've just answered makes me want to change it to what are the circumstances where you imagine the US would step in under Donald Trump?
Well, I think that there's a view in Washington that Eastern Europe is basically Russia's sphere of influence. And one person quite close to the Trump camp said to me a few months ago, please tell your friends that if they think the United States will risk nuclear war for a field in southern Lithuania, they're very much mistaken. And it's always been a bit of a stretch, to be honest, the idea that the Americans would risk a Soviet or Russian nuclear strike that would take out a city, Chicago or something, in order to protect countries on the other side of the Atlantic. So to some extent, it's always been a bit of a comforting fiction. We've never tested it, and at least the belief that America might do this was enough to deter the Soviets from any major attack on the West. So it kind of worked. But I think that Putin isn't stupid, and what he's actually doing is eroding NATO's defence by nibbling it at the sub-threshold level. If Putin was to announce in 90 days' time, I'm going to seize territory in the Suwalki Gap between Belarus and Kaliningrad unless you give me a transit corridor across there. That would be kind of perfect. Within 90 days, we might even be able to get our reserves mobilized. And by the time of that deadline, we'd probably be in a position to defend against that ultimatum. But that isn't the way it's happening. What's actually happening is Putin is conducting numerous pinprick attacks, I would say escalating pinprick attacks against people, against institutions, against infrastructure. And at each point, it's clear we don't really have a response. And that's where our deterrent is being attacked, not at this sort of grand strategic level, although the result is a grand strategic problem.
If, as you say, you almost want to take the A out of NATO and almost change it to an E and go from Atlantic to European, what sort of fear does NATO, if I'm going to call it that, strike into Putin, into Xi of China, into Iran, say potentially, compared to NATO? If Trump is now effectively taking the US out of this alliance.
This is obviously very good news for the Chinese. They need the West to be divided and distracted so that we don't interfere with their efforts to push their influence in Latin America, African countries, elsewhere in Asia, so that we don't confront them in the South China Sea when they're the sort of creeping blockade of Taiwan, and of course their massive influence operations inside Western countries and their economic and technological dominance and so on and so forth. So Xi Jinping is popping champagne corks every time that NATO is in trouble. There's also big differences of opinion on Iran, and I suspect the Iranian regime will feel the pressure's probably off them a little bit if America and Europe are divided, although Europe hasn't been a huge help on Iran. The odd thing here is the West is still an enormous lump of political, economic and political power. It's 40 trillion GDP, it's 1 billion people, it's got by far the most attractive living standards and ideas and so on. We are, compared with life under the Chinese Communist Party, West still looks pretty good. And yet, because we're in this sort of civil war within the West, it makes it a lot easier for our adversaries.
Is this reluctance by the Americans? I mean, it's easy to characterize it as sort of Trumpian, but I wonder whether willingness to support NATO has eroded over the years, since maybe the end of the Cold War. Did it become more obvious during the war on terror? Is this a George W. Bush thing, for example? Is this where it all began? Or are we just looking at Trump and thinking this is a new level again?
The Americans have been complaining since the 1950s about European unwillingness to spend money on defence. And the Europeans have always scrimped. And we are reaping the consequences of that. There was a huge appetite in the 1990s to extract the peace dividend. And we just decided that we weren't going to worry about China, and we weren't going to worry about Russia, and we weren't going to worry about the social and economic benefits of strong defence. And so we've slimmed down, hollowed out our armed forces. And the Americans are quite right to be cross about that. And when I went door knocking in Pennsylvania for the Harris campaign nearly 6 months ago, I talked to people who said, look, I get 2 weeks vacation, and Europeans get 6. Why are we paying in America for the defence of Europe, which is bigger and richer than we are? And that's a very reasonable question. Now, the answer is that it benefits the United States to have the Europeans as their closest allies. If you want to stand up to China, you've got a much better chance of doing it if you've got allies on your side than if you try and do it just as the United States. But that argument has basically fizzled and I've talked to people in the Trump campaign who said when I said, don't you need Europe as an ally? They said, Europe, ally, seriously, against China, useless. So they didn't take that argument seriously, and the American people, in their wisdom, agreed with them. And so now we face, I think, in the long term, for America, this is terrible. They're losing their allies, and that was what was this kind of American soft empire based on values and cooperation was the foundation of American power. But in the short term, it's very bad for us. We are reaping the consequences of our neglect of the duties of allies, and we are now scrambling to defend ourselves and to create a new deterrent. Um, and we don't really have the time to do it because our enemies are ready and we're not.
Just finally, Edward, I want to take you back. It is linked to what you were just saying, but also to your first answer about Article 5 and the fact that, if you wanted a press release effectively might be enough to sort of play your role as an individual nation if Article 5 was invoked. And that is to say that, the US perhaps not joining in a European conflict is one thing, but is there a concern that it could actually block NATO members from working autonomously, even potentially from going to war? I mean,
Yes,
the
absolutely.
Trident presumably could they remotely disable Trident, for example, the Britain's nuclear deterrent?
Well, the answer is we don't know, but in theory, Trident it hits its target by navigating through the stars, and even Donald Trump can't shift Sirius and the Great Bear. So we probably have a couple of years of a more or less independent deterrent, but those missiles need servicing, and they're American missiles. And in much shorter term, there's a real worry now in countries like Norway, Denmark, Finland and Poland, who've bought expensive American warplanes and missiles, that these won't work when they need them. Donald Trump's quite capable of saying, I don't want American weapons used in a border skirmish with Russia. What he regards as a border skirmish is an existential fight for survival for countries in the Baltic states or elsewhere in the region. And so I think we are going to see a lot of collapsing order books for the American arms companies, and they will put pressure on Trump, and he may reverse course. Really, too late. This is a great time to be a European arms manufacturer, offering genuinely independent kit that actually does what it says on the tin.